He posed for her matrimonial photographs, flashing a convincing grin. He even hauled the heavy cardboard cartons into her new sanctuary. Weeping to investigators, he claimed she possessed the purest soul imaginable. Yet, under the cover of darkness, he returned to that very residence and mercilessly extinguished her existence. The perpetrator was no nameless drifter, nor was this a chance encounter. The threat had shadowed Gail intimately since birth. An individual acutely aware of her precise sleeping quarters, a predator conscious that a simple plea for assistance would lure her spouse outside. For 25 deceptive years, this shadow broke bread with her relatives at every family gathering. Through every solemn wake and joyful milestone, two bloodlines agonized over a mystery, completely oblivious that the monster stood perfectly hidden in plain sight. Holland, Michigan. A picturesque municipality woven with tranquil avenues, an idyllic enclave where residents comfortably leave deadbolts unlatched after dusk. Deep Dutch ancestry permeates the landscape. Towering religious spires, vibrant floral beds, and friendly locals waving from front porches. Natives raised within its borders often characterize the community as a precious sanctuary where genuine security remains a tangible reality. Such unspeakable atrocities are never anticipated here. Yet, malevolence remains entirely indifferent to colorful blossoms, serene pathways, or the harmonious hymns of Sunday congregations. Instead, it ferments deliberately within the shadows, concealed safely behind barricaded entryways. Ultimately, a residence situated along Ransom Street, an ominously prophetic designation, in hindsight, transformed into the epicenter of a nightmare that utterly shattered the locale's psychological foundation. Gail Marie Weingarden entered the world on April 24, 1965. Her formative years unfolded inside a bustling, profoundly united household housing 8 offspring. Wendell, the patriarch, was a World War II survivor, a pillar of unwavering reliability and quiet devotion. He dedicated 26 years to a single employer and worshipped at the identical altar for half a century. His wife, Dorothy, served as the indispensable glue. Finances were perpetually strained, occasionally reaching agonizing scarcity. However, any monetary deficit was vastly overshadowed by their fierce emotional solidarity. Labor was a shared burden. The young girl internalized this reality swiftly, whispering a solemn vow to her youthful self. She determined to grind tirelessly, hoard her personal earnings, and engineer an independent destiny entirely on her terms. Confiding in her elder sibling, Cheryl, she declared a willingness to endure relentless toil to guarantee she could perpetually finance her own desires. This ambition stemmed not from avarice, but fiercely ignited resolve. She entered the workforce serving tables, enduring abysmal wages and grueling hours, yet she possessed an unteachable magnetism. Her radiant charisma effortlessly convinced every patron they were the sole focal point of the establishment. Armed with razor-sharp wit, she generated effortless laughter without ever appearing to try. Gratuities flowed generously, inspired by the authentic joy she injected into their routines. An acquaintance would ultimately characterize her essence as pure, flowing sunlight. Her mere presence altered the atmosphere instantly. The mood brightened, compelling strangers to beam with an unexplained, infectious sense of comfort. Such was the undeniable nature of her spirit. And then, lingering in the shadows, stood Ryan. Arriving on December 12, 1962, he preceded her by roughly 30 months. To outside observers, his towering, stoic demeanor epitomized the ideal masculine protector. He monitored her interactions constantly, embodying the traditional vigilance expected of a watchful male guardian. Tracking every lingering glance directed toward her, he instinctively closed the physical distance whenever she appeared even marginally distressed. To the untrained eye, this masqueraded as fierce familial dedication. In truth, he was not merely safeguarding her, he was intensely scrutinizing her. A perilously fragile boundary separates guardianship from obsessive ownership. Tragically, no one perceived that subtle divide back then, nor did they investigate. Upon reaching her 18th birthday, she encountered an individual named Lars. Their romance accelerated with the reckless momentum typical of adolescent infatuation. They rapidly established a shared residence, constructing the physical structure themselves. Despite projecting a committed facade, the underlying dynamics crumbled due to his chronic unreliability. The psychological inequity driving their partnership continuously widened. True to her character, she exhaustively attempted to salvage the deteriorating bond. Ultimately, she arrived at a brutal realization, inevitably faced by genuine souls. Investing maximum effort into an incompatible partner does not constitute bravery. It merely prolongs the inevitable. Resolving to sever the ties, she boxed up her existence and returned to the property to retrieve her remaining assets. The rejection triggered an ugly response. While she reached into a cabinet to gather her possessions, her ex-lover violently crushed the wooden panel against her fingers. As she recoiled, he delivered a forceful strike to her cheek, ensuring a severe bruise. News of this brutal altercation reached her brother instantly. He sought out the abuser immediately. Bypassing any verbal exchange or preliminary threats, he forcefully grounded the man and shattered his nasal bone. Glaring downward, he delivered a terrifyingly placid directive: never lay a finger on his sibling again. The intimidated ex-boyfriend instantly retreated. The confrontation concluded decisively, allowing the victor to stroll away, draped in the illusion of a valiant savior. Icy and restrained, he lacked the trembling fury characteristic of a typical protective sibling. He radiated a clinical detachment, executing a necessary chore, a chilling composure that raised zero red flags. He successfully played the role of the fierce defender who arrived exactly when required. That carefully constructed narrative became the universally accepted gospel. Yet, that freezing, tranquil stillness was never meant to shelter her. It stemmed from a vastly more sinister psychological origin, a darkness the world would fail to comprehend for another 25 agonizing years. Strangely, the subsequent chapter initially appeared to be an absolute blessing for Gail. Tragically, considering the atrocities lurking on the horizon, this fleeting period of joy makes the impending nightmare utterly devastating to endure. By 1984, Gail had retreated to the safety of her daily grind, returning to her job and methodically constructing the secure future she had long envisioned. It was within those mundane office walls that her path collided with a 25-year-old independent builder. Rick Brink possessed a striking, almost unsettling simplicity. His calloused fingers bore the permanent scars of timber work, while his steadfast promises and seemingly endless emotional endurance defined his core character. He operated with a silent, stoic certainty, utterly devoid of theatrics or deception. If he made a commitment, he materialized at the precise moment expected. Following their initial 1984 encounter, he returned to his childhood home and delivered a hauntingly prophetic declaration to his mother. He had just found his future wife. There was zero exaggeration in his voice, only his typical, grounded resolve. Their bond locked into place with the kind of permanence that rarely shatters. Their romance lacked volatile sparks or turbulent passion, rooted instead in a profound stability. They both shared a deeply ingrained belief that genuine reward demanded relentless labor. Beneath their calm exteriors, the pair harbored an identical, unspoken craving for an authentic existence. They rejected superficial glamour in favor of concrete foundations, a secure household, honorable professions, and a bloodline forged through their own sheer willpower. Employed as a carpentry instructor at the Trenway furniture plant, Rick commanded deep admiration from his peers. He was a cornerstone worker, dependable and masterful. Meanwhile, Gail anchored the clerical operations at Donnelly Automotive with sharp focus, unwavering diligence, and habitual punctuality. Colleagues would eventually recall her as a silent force of nature, executing tasks flawlessly while actively avoiding the spotlight. Looking back, close companion Bill Whedon described her presence as a beacon, painting her as the radiant warmth illuminating even the darkest, coldest spaces. That truth was hardly a revelation to Rick, who recognized her brilliance upon their very first meeting. The warmer months inevitably drew them toward Lake Michigan. His relatives maintained a coastal sanctuary, complete with a personal watercraft, providing the scenic backdrop where he instructed her in aquatic sports. Endless daylight hours, drifting on the waves, transitioned into sun-drenched, joyful returns. Those family gatherings bled late into the night, stretching far beyond their intended bounds. These seasonal escapes offered more than mere recreation. They provided tangible evidence. They confirmed a profound, mutual contentment thriving in the silent, ordinary moments that define true human connection. Their union was formalized on April 25, 1986, a mere 24 hours following her 21st birthday. An intimate chapel hosted an exclusive circle of cherished guests, devoid of unnecessary excess. The bride donned a pristine, full-skirted gown suspended by delicate shoulder ties. Clad in a striking azure blazer and coordinated neckwear, the groom radiated the quiet triumph of a man finally claiming his ultimate, lifelong prize. Festivities followed at an upscale recreational facility resting right on the water's edge. The couple swayed together as the hours vanished, with her joyful exuberance replacing any quiet repose. Once the celebration concluded, they vanished onto a maritime getaway. Sun-baked shores and temperate tides dictated their rhythm, entirely isolated in their own private sanctuary. Yet, upon their return, harsh reality demanded their immediate focus. Garrett, the groom's father, located a remote parcel of land lingering on Holland's perimeter, a sprawling, single-story dwelling situated along Ransom Street. Spanning 20 solitary acres, the grounds offered profound silence, deliberately distanced from civilization and the prying eyes of adjacent residents. At first glance, the vast expanse promised unbridled liberation. However, the structure itself concealed a dark, battered history. The former occupant, a notorious local figure dubbed Shotgun Sid, forfeited the estate during a brutal financial seizure. Prior to abandoning the premises, he mercilessly scavenged its remains. Hardware was violently torn from the drywall, leaving ruined storage units dangling and chambers abandoned in a state of desolate despair. Through shrewd bartering, Garrett managed to secure an acquisition figure that rendered the ruined estate affordable. Pacing across the devastated corridors, Rick envisioned a masterpiece rising from the decay. The total seclusion, the vast acreage, the utter lack of witnesses, and the desperate need for reconstruction. This isolated combination transformed the desolate plot into an exclusive, impenetrable fortress designed solely for them. While aesthetically romantic, the extreme isolation harbored a silent, insidious danger that went entirely unnoticed. Relocating in October 1987, they aggressively launched their restoration campaign. Scratched floorboards were stripped and polished, shattered partitions seamlessly mended, and destroyed cupboards completely swapped out. Gripping a camcorder, Rick chronicled the entire metamorphosis, wandering the halls while providing a calm, hauntingly relaxed commentary on their structural triumphs. Whenever the lens drifted toward his wife, she would momentarily halt her labor to offer a warm grin, occasionally flashing a playful gesture toward the camera. Her bright chuckles echoed in response to his banter. Yet, one specific fragment of that tape carries a crushing psychological weight when viewed through the lens of impending tragedy. The viewfinder sweeps deliberately across a vacant, confined space situated at the corridor's dead end. Stripped drywall and raw timber flooring sat frozen in anticipation of a new purpose. This hollow chamber was destined to house their first child. She had eagerly confided in her sibling, Cheryl, mapping out specific wall patterns, the exact placement of the infant's bed, and her overarching artistic vision. The couple stood poised on the precipice of parenthood. This structural void was meant to encapsulate the very essence of their relentless ambition. Fate abruptly severed that timeline forever. As twilight descended on November 21st, 1987, the pair donned formal wear for a companion's nuptial celebration at a local hotel, reveling, moving to the music, and indulging in a few cocktails. A slight intoxication brought out her infectious giggles. Witnesses from that night recall observing the duo navigating the banquet hall with a hauntingly serene comfort. They appeared as a bonded unit, entirely fulfilled and devoid of anything left to prove. Shortly before 11 o'clock at night, they offered their final farewells. Stepping shoulder to shoulder into the frigid, oppressive Michigan darkness, they were instantly met by the bitter, slicing chill that defines late autumn in Holland. He likely draped an arm across her shoulders as they slipped into their vehicle, the high beams slicing through the pitch-black night. It was a routine journey back to Ransom Street, where 20 sprawling acres sat enveloped in total silence. Their lovingly restored house featured a vacant space down the corridor. None of the wedding guests paid any mind to the couple slipping away. Guests depart celebrations constantly. Yet, not a single soul left in that hall would ever hear Rick or Gail Brink speak again. They possessed a flawless life, a residence crafted by their own sweat, fulfilling careers, an authentic romance, and a future baby's room just waiting for that final, life-changing decision. What invisible force shattered this reality? The terrible truth was mingling right there at the party, camouflaged within their own bloodline, masquerading as a deeply trusted confidant. Picture a morning buzzer echoing through a hollow space, with zero hands extending to silence the blare. Absolute stillness, save for that mechanical shrieking, fading only when the mechanism exhausted itself. On Monday, November 23rd, Rick Brink was entirely absent from his shift. Trenway management flagged his truancy almost immediately. This was not a fellow who simply vanished off the grid unannounced. His non-appearance triggered an instant red flag. A chilling void registered the precise moment his regular arrival time ticked by. Management dialed his residence. The line chimed endlessly into a void. Another attempt yielded the exact same desolate ringing. A creeping dread began to escalate rapidly. Desperate for answers, the supervisor contacted his employee's mother and father. Garrett and Ida were completely in the dark. A frantic call to Gail's employer confirmed the nightmare she had also failed to punch in. 2 missing spouses. The identical dawn, 0 notifications, 0 clues, and absolute radio silence from the pair. The parents scrambled into their vehicle. Envision that agonizing commute, a suffocating quiet hovering between husband and wife, terrified to voice the impending horror. Navigating that isolated rural road toward the acreage, their eyes locked onto a familiar sight. His Chevrolet Blazer, resting squarely in the drive. A fleeting wave of comfort washed over them. The truck's presence surely meant its owner was near. The patriarch approached the SUV. The motor radiated 0 heat against the biting autumn chill. His boy remained in the cabin, but tragically motionless. He was pitched awkwardly downward, legs jammed low, chest draped heavily over the middle console, skull positioned by the opposite door. Dawn's illumination pierced the windshield, exposing the gruesome aftermath of a horrific assault. In a split second, a father's entire universe shattered into pieces. Pivoting away, he braced his trembling wife, guiding her back to safety with strict orders to remain seated. What followed was a grim duty no parent should ever endure. He pivoted again, braving the eerie residence unaccompanied. The main entryway bore 0 signs of tampering. No splintered wood, no breached deadbolts, not a single object disturbed in the foyer. The devastated man navigated the chilling stillness toward the master suite. A heavy, malignant hush void of tranquility, rich with dread, crushed his lungs as he finally turned the knob. Gail lay upon the mattress. The fluid beneath her had completely stabilized, utterly motionless without a solitary wave. She appeared locked in a deep slumber. Her posture seemed incredibly casual and serene, yet a cushion obscured her visage. Trembling, the older man removed it. Retreating to the outdoors, he phoned law enforcement, then sank into the passenger seat beside his partner, burying the nightmarish visual deep inside himself. Words were entirely unnecessary. As officers flooded the premises and documented the interior, the forensics told a remarkably bizarre tale. Rather than highlighting a perpetrator, the environment systematically ruled out countless theories. The exterior remained pristine, no shattered glass, no compromised thresholds. The phantom who breached their sanctuary was someone the victims, or, at minimum, one of them willingly welcomed inside. 0 property was pilfered. Nothing felt rummaged through. The husband's billfold rested conspicuously on the culinary island. His wife's handbag sat adjacent. Both bulged with paper currency, plastic, and identification completely ignored. Authorities discovered $280 upstairs and another $240 tucked in a culinary cabinet. More than $500 resting completely exposed. The assassin bypassed every single bill. Even the matrimonial bands remained on their lifeless fingers. Valuable trinkets adorned the vanity alongside a pair of timepieces. Not a solitary item vanished. Profit was never the motive, nor was this a crime of opportunity. The abandoned SUV provided detectives with their primary clue. The glass on the operator's side had been lowered a mere fraction. Simultaneously, a lethal projectile had completely pierced the opposite side panel. Shards exploded outward, indicating an errant trajectory, proving the victim occupied the captain's seat while an executioner stood just inches away and pulled the trigger. Nobody creates an opening for an unknown drifter, especially not under the cloak of darkness on remote acreage. He cracked that pane solely due to familiarity. He simply sensed 0 impending danger. Within the sleeping quarters, a trio of calculated, precise shots claimed the resting woman. The chamber lacked any indicators of a brawl. She passed utterly unaware. Defense was an impossibility. Investigators scoured the exterior driveway, combed the lawn, swept the rugs, and analyzed the corridors, yielding absolutely 0. No spent shells or metallic remnants remained. The executioner did not succumb to adrenaline and run. They methodically ensured their tracks were completely erased. The murderer utilized a firearm designed to harbor its expended ammunition, a .22 caliber revolver, exactly as lab technicians later verified. The perpetrator crossed that threshold with a chillingly precise objective, executing every step without a hint of hesitation. Yet, an unsettling anomaly brought the crime scene technicians to a dead halt, the decorative cushion resting gently over the female victim's features. Forensic scrutiny revealed an absolute absence of bullet defects through the fabric, confirming a terrifying sequence where the item was entirely absent during the actual gunfire. The assailant deliberately positioned the object over her lifeless body, and even more bizarrely, this item did not belong amongst the bedroom furnishings. Its origin was the front parlor. The phantom intruder purposefully navigated down the corridor, retrieved that specific cushion, retraced their steps, and meticulously shrouded her expression. Pause, and let the psychological weight of that action truly sink in for a moment. We are not looking at a frantic suspect fleeing a chaotic scene, but rather an individual who intentionally lingered, sought out a specific item, and returned to conceal their handiwork. A perpetrator fundamentally incapable of maintaining visual contact with the horrific aftermath they had just orchestrated. Burdened by an overwhelming wave of remorse, sorrow, or dark fixation, they were compelled to obscure her visage prior to vanishing, proving the fabric represented something utterly divorced from raw brutality. It stood as a deeply profound testament to something infinitely more chilling, profound intimacy. It betrayed a profoundly warped, deeply personal bond with the deceased woman, and this singular, haunting clue would languish silently within archival boxes for 25 long years. When fresh investigative eyes eventually dusted off those records, that one behavioral signature would perfectly illuminate the precise nature of their quarry. Initial hypotheses evaporated almost instantly, and any speculation regarding a tragic domestic homicide-suicide was entirely dismantled once personnel noted the glaring absence of a firearm, and authorities thoroughly scoured the outerwear, beneath the corpse, and across the exterior grounds, finding absolutely nothing an outside predator was undeniably responsible for pulling the trigger. The fatal mechanism was activated twice, and while forensics lifted a mere half-dozen latent prints from the environment, 4 originated from the deceased, leaving 2 mysteries clinging to the commode and receiver. Those rogue impressions failed to generate a single hit across national criminal registries, leaving the trail dead with only that misplaced furnishing. A vehicle's glass intentionally lowered for an acquaintance, $500 in cash completely ignored, and a vibrant couple, celebrating marital bliss just 48 hours prior, permanently erased. During the memorial service, the presiding clergyman surveyed a congregation drowning in grief and delivered an opening sentiment that permanently etched itself into their collective memory. Such unspeakable darkness is entirely devoid of divine intention. This is the pure, unfiltered manifestation of profound evil. The deceased sibling, Bud, found those chilling syllables echoing within his psyche forever, while the entire audience absorbed a terrifying accuracy, transcending basic theological concepts. The monstrous entity that breached the sanctuary of that residence, the phantom who executed an entirely defenseless, slumbering target, and then deliberately paused to shroud her identity, using a deeply out-of-place household item that pointed to a horrifyingly intimate motivation, a simmering, venomous hatred that had festered silently in the shadows for years, meant law enforcement prepared to hunt down a veritable fiend. Unfortunately, their crosshairs were completely misaligned, as the architect of this nightmare was not lurking in some distant, ambiguous obscurity. The perpetrator actively mingled among the shattered relatives, physically assisting with the floral arrangements, and loudly broadcasting his sympathies to every passing ear. He relentlessly repeated how exceptionally wonderful the victims had been. Uncovering the truth behind these tragedies requires approximately 14 days of exhaustive investigation, meticulous verification, and sleepless hours pursuing accuracy. We are examining the obliterated lives of actual human beings, and their memories demand nothing less than our absolute dedication. Demonstrating your support for these deep dive explorations ensures these forgotten narratives are continually brought into the light. Share the specific psychological anomalies of this investigation that resonate most deeply with you, and explore further resolved historical mysteries detailed within the supplementary information below. Returning to the grim reality of the investigation, whenever detectives face a dual homicide utterly devoid of forensic breadcrumbs, they pivot forcefully toward the human element. The standard protocol dictates scrutinizing the immediate inner circle before expanding the perimeter, systematically testing every interpersonal dynamic until a hidden truth unravels. Yet, in this particular labyrinth, every promising lead disintegrated upon contact, with the initial focus instantly locking onto Lars, the former partner responsible for violently bruising her during their bitter separation. Burdened by a documented pattern of domestic hostility, he allegedly harbored lingering emotional attachments, while acquaintances painted a picture of a deeply resentful individual, quietly enraged that his former lover had successfully moved on. In the purely theoretical realm of behavioral profiling, he presented as the quintessential candidate for such an emotionally charged slaughter. Law enforcement swiftly pulled him into an interrogation room. The ex-partner vehemently rejected the accusations, showing absolute zero hesitation when challenged to undergo a lie detector examination, which he navigated flawlessly without a single deceptive marker. Furthermore, his whereabouts during the dark hours of November 21st were solidly corroborated by an ironclad network of independent observers. Authorities officially eliminated him from the suspect matrix within mere days, and shortly thereafter, an uninvited figure boldly strolled directly into the precinct headquarters. Detectives had not spent a single resource hunting him. He simply materialized at the front desk as Sid Cobby, a notorious local fixture infamously dubbed Shotgun Sid throughout the jurisdiction. His historical connection to the property on Ransom Street extended far deeper than a simple financial foreclosure, having functioned as a narcotics transporter, funneling illicit substances from Detroit into the Western Territories for the highwaymen. He possessed an extensive resume of trafficking illegal firearms, operating entirely within an underworld ecosystem where lethal adversaries are an absolute certainty. Yet, a sudden moral crisis regarding suppliers targeting local teenagers prompted him to aggressively change sides, transforming himself into a highly confidential asset for the federal government. Consequently, extremely dangerous factions possessed significant motivations to permanently extinguish his life, and he arrived at the station armed with a highly specific hypothesis. He was utterly convinced that an assigned hitman had actively hunted him down, only to mistakenly obliterate the current, entirely innocent occupants of his former residence. Sitting across from the investigators, he began painting a grim portrait of the dangerous reality he once managed from behind those very same walls. The Highwaymen Syndicate operated through an extensive, deeply entrenched network, one notorious for erupting into sudden, brutal bloodshed. A previous encounter saw a trio of armed enforcers arrive at the Ransom Street property wielding a scattergun, only retreating when the resident drew a firearm of his own and firmly stood his ground. The intended target was an automobile seized as leverage for unpaid narcotics debts. Yet, the sinister implication lingered. The residents had been marked by underworld intimidation long before Rick and Gail ever unpacked their belongings. Investigators delved into the dark underbelly, coordinating with vice squads who managed covert operatives embedded deep within the biker faction. Two monikers emerged from the shadows: Ghetto and Grizz. Suspicion spiked instantly when Grizz was gunned down on the streets of Detroit barely 7 days following the Brink massacre. Authorities dragged Ghetto into an interrogation room, but his vehement denials of any participation were chillingly persuasive. Sid took matters into his own hands, leveraging personal back-channel associates in a desperate bid to discover if a hit squad had truly been dispatched to the home. His shadow investigation yielded absolutely nothing. Every potential whisper of a conspiracy unraveled into dead ends. The notion of a botched hit disintegrated, joining a growing pile of failed hypotheses. While the official dossier swelled in size, actionable clues withered away into nothingness. Then the eve of Christmas arrived, plunging the town of Holland back into a nightmare. Rock Wilson returned from a corporate gathering during the bleak, pre-dawn hours of December 24th. Blazing illumination poured from every window of his residence. Ominously, the rear glass door stood ajar, yawning out toward an expanse of pitch-black acreage. His spouse, Deborah, had vanished from the interior. After a frantic telephone call to his father, the two men scoured the frozen earth, ultimately discovering her lifeless form beside a desolate garden plot. The 30-year-old woman lay amidst the dirt, the victim of an unfathomably savage and lethal assault. Deborah shared an alma mater with the late Rick Brink. Furthermore, her property was situated barely a half-mile away from the cursed Ransom Street address. The geographic proximity was terrifying. A mere 5-minute stroll across open pasture separated the two bloodbaths. The local populace immediately spiraled into sheer panic. Their terror was entirely justified. Neither crime scene displayed any signs of a breach, nor had a single item of value been pilfered from the residences. Both sets of casualties were universally regarded as diligent, beloved individuals, devoid of any known adversaries. The atrocities occurred a mere 30 days apart, within an unnervingly tight radius. The dread deepened when detectives exhumed a forgotten, chillingly similar homicide file dating back to 1977. A 20-year-old girl named Deborah Polinsky had been butchered with a blade inside her own sleeping quarters. Her residence was positioned just under a mile from the Brink estate. 3 horrific slaughters, contained within the exact same sliver of Ottawa County, spanning 10 years. The era of casual, unlocked doors abruptly evaporated. Lifelong neighbors, accustomed to friendly morning greetings, suddenly began scrutinizing one another through a lens of profound, creeping paranoia. Frightened citizens flooded local law enforcement with urgent petitions, desperately pleading for an escalated police footprint in the shadows of their streets. The terrifying prospect of an apex predator stalking their very backyards, a phantom that had successfully claimed 3 lives, forced Holland to confront the agonizing illusion of its own security. Federal profiling specialists were summoned to decode the madness, while seasoned tacticians from the Michigan State Police scrutinized the trio of grim dossiers. Detectives hunted feverishly for microscopic connective tissue, a shared acquaintance, a mutual habit, or any hidden intersection binding the deceased. Every potential thread frayed into nothingness. Ultimately, authorities determined that the bloodshed was entirely unrelated. Different executioners, driven by distinct, malevolent urges. The perceived serial killer was merely a phantom constructed from geographic coincidence and communal hysteria. While the terrified town finally breathed a collective sigh of relief, the Brink family remained trapped. Their nightmare was never rooted in the myth of a random prowler. Their dread was infinitely more intimate and suffocating, and the agonizing mystery of who betrayed them was far from over. A single, unsettling fragment from the initial inquiry was deliberately kept out of the press, yet it lingered like a ghost in the background. A colleague of Gail approached law enforcement with a revelation that froze detectives in their tracks. During the fortnight preceding the slaughter, Gail's demeanor had shifted in a subtle but undeniable way. The radiant presence who once breathed life into any space had suddenly retreated into the shadows, adopting a hushed and guarded aura. It was as though she had suddenly been burdened by an invisible, suffocating weight, a psychological toll that was entirely foreign to her nature. Her signature effervescence had been completely eclipsed during those terminal 14 days. What dark truth had she witnessed, overheard, or finally pieced together? What horrific secret was slowly crushing Gail Brink in her final days, a secret she took silently to the grave? That haunting inquiry was simply stuffed into a manila folder alongside the rest of the debris. The binder was buried in a steel drawer, where agonizing months bled into hollow years. The initial flood of citizen tips, once peaking at 4 or 5 daily, evaporated into total silence. Every seemingly solid breadcrumb pulverized into dust the moment investigators touched it. The investigation descended into the suffocating, stagnant, quiet, unique to unsolved murders. It was not abandoned by memory, simply frozen in time. A full decade following the butchery, a regional publication printed a retrospective, jolting the public with the chilling reminder that the predator remained free. Ida, the devastated mother of Rick, provided an interview to the journalist, delivering a statement that dropped with the agonizing weight of a tombstone. The perpetual paranoia torments you. Is the monster walking among us? Does he smile at our faces while harboring the secret of our boy's slaughter? Tragically, she could not fathom how accurate her terror was. She was entirely oblivious that the very psychopath she feared had almost undeniably stood shoulder to shoulder with her during the funeral service. The perpetrator had likely embraced her trembling frame, stared directly into her tear-filled eyes, and offered hollow condolences about Gail being an absolute angel. Wendell Weingarden was a resilient veteran of global conflict, a man who devoted decades of his existence to the quiet, pious service of his congregation and his loved ones. Yet, even a man forged by war could not withstand the agonizing, soul-crushing despair of never knowing the true fate of his little girl. In July 2005, nearly 2 decades after his daughter was brutally stolen from him, he passed away. He took every tormenting, unresolved question into the earth. For years, the investigation gathered dust. While grieving relatives begged for the truth, Reality remained stubbornly concealed. Meanwhile, the predator who harbored the ultimate secret since dawn, on November 22, 1987, the individual who calmly rose from bed that fateful morning, maintained his routine, stood among the mourners, and offered hollow condolences. He inhaled the air of freedom, a luxury he permanently stole from the couple. He stayed rooted in Ottawa County, blending in seamlessly. Yet, the year 2009 was rapidly approaching. That year brought a pair of investigators entirely detached from the Weingarden bloodline. They possessed no sentimental ties to Ransom Street and owed absolutely nothing to anyone involved. They brought razor-sharp perspective to a decaying dossier and a misplaced cushion that had baffled prior authorities. In 2009, Ottawa County launched its Cold Case Division. A singular mandate guided these officers. No active homicides, no modern diversions. Their sole purpose was unearthing forgotten atrocities entombed in steel archives, rewinding the clock. These two relentless investigators were Dave Blakely and Venus Repper. Crucially, neither investigator called the town home. Stripped of community bias, generational gossip, or deep-rooted allegiances, they were impervious to local influence. They entered the fray as unburdened strangers. In a psychological puzzle, this convoluted, profound detachment was their greatest weapon. Upon extracting the Brink dossier, the crushing age of the evidence struck immediately. They found yellowing parchment, scribbled by lawmen who had long vanished. Certain transcripts were so ravaged by time that the pair meticulously reconstructed them with adhesive just to decipher the faded ink. Picture that haunting scene. Two solitary figures hunched over a desk, physically reassembling the shattered shards of a grim narrative sitting unresolved for over 20 years. This was their painstaking reality. They rebuilt the timeline, fragment by agonizingly slow fragment. Their relentless pursuit yielded over 200 interrogations. When key figures vanished across state lines, the detectives aggressively tracked them down. Venus navigated the darkness armed with one chillingly accurate philosophy driving her interrogations. Allegiances inevitably fracture over time. Remorse metastasizes, and hidden truths become a crushing psychological weight. An accomplice fabricating an alibi back in 1987 likely suffered 2 agonizing decades of regret. The passage of time fundamentally alters human psychology. It slowly devours the very justifications that once enforced their silence. The investigators weaponized this exact psychological decay. Right from the onset, a singular identity haunted the margins of the vintage reports. This individual drifted through witness accounts like a phantom, a recurring anomaly that prior detectives had somehow never directly interrogated. That phantom was Ryan Weingarden, the elder sibling of Gail. A terrifyingly clear mosaic began forming. Cheryl, the eldest sister, maintained agonizingly meticulous records. She revealed to authorities that a mere 3 days following the bloodbath, amidst the suffocating atmosphere of the family's collective mourning, Ryan nonchalantly initiated a highly detailed conversation regarding the grisly scene. He vividly outlined a phantom navigating the corridor, specifically detailing how Gail was submerged in the liquid, twisted unnaturally leftward. His chillingly precise description was utterly impossible for an innocent bystander. Then, he dropped a deeply disturbing thought. I occasionally wonder if I could have actually done this. At the time, his relatives dismissed the sinister remark as severe trauma, assuming shattered minds produce unsettling outbursts. Yet, analyzing that specific phrase through the cold lens of hindsight shifts its psychological weight from mourning to psychopathy. Upon receiving the initial vague notification of the fatalities, Ryan abruptly rose and drove directly to the house without uttering an inquiry. He never demanded to know which medical center or begged for a misunderstanding. His unhesitating beeline suggested a man intimately aware of the carnage's geography. In the immediate aftermath of the burial, while the graveyard soil remained fresh, he cornered an acquaintance to liquidate Gail's waterbed. This was the exact piece of furniture acting as her deathbed. He eagerly sought cash for the macabre item while her body was barely cold. Displaying the cold calculation of a businessman rather than a grieving brother, he unauthorizedly scoured her private correspondence. He intercepted romantic notes from suitors and incinerated them outside, smoothly claiming he was shielding his mother and father from scandalous discoveries. He seized this role entirely unprompted, acting as the self-appointed executioner of her remaining legacy. And then, investigators uncovered Aunt Nava. She testified that on the precise date of the massacre, Mere hours before the couple was slaughtered, she received isolated phone calls from both siblings. Gail dialed in first, expressing intense frustration over financial debts, trapped as the guarantor absorbing the burden of his severe delinquency. Shortly after, Ryan claimed his sibling had undergone a transformation. He seethed with rage, accusing her of overwhelming arrogance, furious that she denied their parents permission to store a recreational vehicle. Two parallel conversations, exact same day. Two colliding forces of anger, venting to the exact same confidant. By midnight, a double homicide silenced the dispute. During the solemn memorial, Ryan hovered near Nava and whispered something deeply disturbing. Had they simply allowed the parents to park that trailer, they would still be breathing today. He genuinely muttered those words over her casket. However, the most violently incriminatory slip of the tongue materialized during a mundane telephone chat 13 years later. Cheryl was casually catching up with Ryan. Amidst the idle chatter, he brought up a pest problem. With the chilling nonchalance of a man discussing the weather, he confessed, "I grabbed my .22 caliber and executed the thing." A chilling realization stopped Cheryl completely. She never knew Ryan possessed a .22. The exact instant she probed, he desperately backpedaled to conceal his tracks. Before the damning words fully materialized, he frantically scrambled to erase them, claiming his tongue had simply slipped. He claimed it was an entirely different firearm, completely unrelated to a .22. Yet in the criminal underworld, reality rarely arrives neatly packaged in a tearful admission. Dark secrets seldom emerge during highly dramatic interrogations. Instead, they bleed through tiny psychological fractures, a stray digit, a specific caliber, a damning fragment escaping before the conscious brain can intervene. Gail and Rick Brink were slaughtered with a .22 caliber revolver. It was the exact phantom piece of hardware investigators had sought for years. Now, 13 agonizing years post-carnage, the very man haunting that residence casually let the specific ammunition type bleed out during a mundane telephone conversation. He frantically retracted it upon sensing his catastrophic blunder. Naturally, investigators permanently cemented that dark anomaly right into the official dossier. Detectives Blakely and Repper aggressively reopened the dusty alibi Ryan had firmly established back in 1987. His story claimed he and Pam were quietly washing clothes and watching a companion's children. Pam supposedly corroborated this domestic illusion. Past authorities blindly swallowed the narrative and walked away. Yet, a glaring omission hidden in the archives instantly froze the blood of both modern investigators. Astonishingly, nobody ever bothered calling the supposed homeowner. Throughout 1987, not a single badge picked up a receiver to ask one vital question. Were they truly present during the massacre? This supposedly airtight defense relied entirely on the unverified word of two romantically involved suspects. That was absolutely it. One catastrophic oversight, a profoundly negligent assumption, allowed a ruthless predator to roam the streets unchecked for more than 2 decades. Plunging deeper into the decaying paperwork revealed a much more sinister anomaly waiting in the shadows. During the initial hunt, Pam actually submitted to a lie detector. On paper, her fabricated timeline mirrored Ryan's alibi flawlessly. Yet, strapped to the machine, when bluntly asked if she accompanied Ryan during the slaughter, Pam coldly uttered a single word, no. The sensors registered zero deception. That explosive contradiction rotted in the evidence boxes for an eternity, completely ignored by anyone possessing the authority to act. Hunting for fresh threads, Blakely and Repper tracked down Crystal, Ryan's former lover from 1987. She voluntarily entered the room, exhibiting an eerie calm, while verifying the mundane mechanics of Ryan's past timeline. The dialogue dragged on, yielding nothing. The detectives expressed their gratitude, stacked their dossiers, and prepared to leave completely empty-handed. Actually, there is one last detail, Crystal murmured. Both hardened investigators slowly sank right back into their chairs. Crystal quietly revealed a terrifying truth. During the paranoid week immediately following the bloodbath, Ryan had shown up at her door. A dark, psychological compulsion drew him toward the Ransom Street crime scene, desperate for a lingering glimpse. Yet, Crystal vehemently resisted, utterly refusing to shadow anywhere near that macabre property. Redirecting their route, they retreated to an isolated park bordering northern Holland. Once the engine cut, Ryan slipped into a chilling, unbroken silence, lost within his own mind. He eventually confessed to harboring a dark, suffocating secret, A heavy, agonizing silence lingered for minutes before he could actually speak. He finally revealed the chilling reality. A hidden sexual entanglement with Gail stretching back into youth. The twisted dynamic took root at age 12, while Gail was a mere 9. He would later dismiss the trauma as innocent intrigue, a shared, entirely willing discovery. Crystal instantly recognized the deception back then, just as Detective Blakely firmly rejected it today. A 9-year-old possesses absolutely no capacity to agree to such depravity. Whatever gentle vocabulary Ryan utilized to mask his actions, the reality was unadulterated predation. The sinister dynamic took root during Gail's 9th year, festering in the shadows as both siblings matured. During their final encounter, Gail explicitly begged him to stop before being overpowered, a chilling reality he voluntarily confessed to Crystal. Idling inside a vehicle at a Holland park mere days after burying his sibling, he coldly detailed the ultimate violation against his sister, bizarrely expecting his current girlfriend to provide comfort. Crystal, however, was far from finished. She painted a vivid picture for the investigators of a seemingly innocent afternoon, an excursion where Ryan, Gail, and Rick shared a vessel on the open water. Gail had dressed for the sun in a 2-piece swimsuit. Right there, mere feet from her husband, Ryan found himself paralyzed by an undeniable fixation, his gaze entirely locked onto her flesh. This was no fleeting glance. It was the unblinking, heavy stare of a man who had completely surrendered to his darkest, most primal urges. Later, Ryan would produce a photograph from that very afternoon. Tapping his finger against Gail's sun-drenched image, he brazenly remarked to Crystal about her overwhelming physical allure. He openly confessed to navigating that entire voyage in a trance, his mind utterly devoured by a silent, burning infatuation. Then came the psychological turning point, the precise second Rick finally caught him. The two men locked eyes, exchanging a heavy, chilling realization that required absolutely zero dialogue to convey its meaning. In that suspended, terrifying beat, Ryan felt totally unmasked. It was as if Rick had peered straight through him, illuminating the twisted obsession he desperately needed to keep buried. Deep in her subconscious, Crystal had always harbored a quiet dread regarding Ryan's unsettling verbal fixations on Gail. His observations were always unnervingly precise, his focus disturbingly sharp. For years, she had desperately shoved that creeping unease into the shadows of her mind. Yet, under Blakely and Repper's intense scrutiny, her long-held secrets finally spilled out into the room. Suddenly, the detectives grasped the exact psychological link they had been desperately chasing. It was not forensic proof, but an element far more lethal in this twisted puzzle. A motive. Cold, undeniable, and deeply rooted, Ryan mercilessly tormented his sibling throughout the entirety of their youth. As Gail built a stable life alongside Rick, growing more comfortable and placing deeper trust in her new husband, the looming threat that she might finally reveal the dark truth steadily intensified. And Rick had clearly sensed something amiss out on that boat. Ryan had witnessed that sudden realization in his eyes. The individual who slaughtered them was no random intruder seeking quick cash or cheap revenge. He was simply a man paralyzed by the sheer terror of his own unmasking. He was an individual who had successfully deluded himself into believing his vile actions against his younger sister were somehow justifiable. And ultimately, he was a predator who calculated that securing her permanent silence was well worth the cost of 2 human lives. Detectives Blakely and Repper hauled Ryan and Pam into the precinct for rigorous interrogation. Ryan entered the room, instantly dominating the atmosphere, projecting absolute authority before he even took a seat. He fiercely demanded to sit in on Pam's questioning. The investigators flatly denied his request. He aggressively challenged their decision, but they remained utterly unyielding in their stance. Ultimately, he was forced to wait in the corridor, yet he went out of his way to ensure every single person in that precinct understood his profound displeasure with the arrangement. Pam stepped cautiously into the stark interrogation room and took her seat. Her trembling hands maintained a vice-like grip around the worn strap of her handbag. She nervously darted her eyes toward the heavy door on multiple occasions. She appeared meek, hushed, and deeply guarded, a stark contrast to the volatile man pacing the halls outside. The grueling interview dragged on for 3 excruciating hours. For the vast majority of that time, Pam stubbornly stuck to the script. She monotonously regurgitated the exact same fabricated narrative she had been peddling for well over 2 decades. A trip to the laundromat, a visit to a friend's residence, staying together the entire night. The syllables slipped out, rehearsed, and entirely devoid of emotion, exactly how a calculated deception sounds after thousands of repetitions. But the psychological tide turned the moment detectives confronted her with the startling polygraph results from 1987. That forgotten document, where she clearly answered negatively when pressed if she had stayed with Ryan on the night of the murders, had been quietly resting in the archives for 22 long years. A subtle fracture appeared across her stoic expression. Her eyes fell heavily toward the table, her tone grew frail, and after 3 grueling hours, Pam finally voiced the undeniable truth. The long-held alibi was a complete fabrication. They had indeed visited the laundromat together near 6 o'clock in the evening, but both had securely returned home by 8. Shortly after, Ryan departed the residence entirely alone. She claimed no knowledge of his destination, nor did she dare inquire. She merely presumed he was out peddling illicit narcotics. He had been battling severe financial ruin, and pushing drugs remained his primary source of income. He reappeared only briefly to smoke with her before vanishing into the night once more. She did not lay eyes on him again until roughly 9 o'clock the subsequent morning. That singular admission was the absolute limit of her cooperation that day. She adamantly refused to utter another syllable. The psychological stranglehold Ryan maintained over her, even while banished to a waiting area down the corridor, remained suffocating enough to completely silence her. As the tense session drew to a close, Ryan could be seen violently pounding his fists against the reinforced glass of the room, aggressively demanding her immediate release. The investigators reluctantly allowed her to leave, yet their pursuit was far from over. In the uneasy days that followed, Ryan flooded Detective Blakely's answering machine with more than 30 erratic voicemails. These desperate recordings fluctuated wildly from borderline, incoherent rambling to outright hostility. In one particularly chilling message, he proclaimed, "I despise you, yet I appreciate you all at once. You are a necessary evil. You are completely barking up the wrong tree here. I possess absolutely zero knowledge regarding this tragedy." In a separate furious tirade, he vehemently accused law enforcement of maliciously dredging up sordid family secrets, terrorizing his fragile wife, and unjustly framing him for the crime. He additionally reached out to his estranged sister Cheryl, the very same sibling who had spent years operating in the shadows, relentlessly hunting for justice. He manipulatively claimed he had finally forgiven her for a bitter historical dispute, preaching that life was far too fleeting and proposing a heartfelt reunion. He pointedly reminded her that blood runs thicker than water. This calculated outreach occurred in October 2012, the exact same month both he and Pam had faced intense scrutiny from the specialized cold case division. This sudden desire for family unity was hardly coincidental. Come January 2013, Blakely and Repper initiated a bold, tactical maneuver. They ambushed Pam at her place of employment with no prior warning, and crucially, without Ryan's looming shadow. They informed her in a low, measured tone that they represented a dedicated cold case task force, that this unresolved slaughter was their sole focus, and that they absolutely refused to fade into the background. They made it chillingly clear that their only objective was unearthing the unvarnished truth. Cornered by her own conscience, Pam finally agreed to accompany them. On this pivotal occasion, she piloted her own vehicle to the precinct, crossing the threshold entirely alone with no overbearing husband at her side, free from his suffocating surveillance. Taking her seat opposite the seasoned investigators, her entire demeanor had visibly shifted. She appeared utterly drained, bearing a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. Yet, she carried a grounded resilience, utterly absent in prior encounters, embodying someone who had finally crossed a mental Rubicon, desperate to shed a crushing psychological burden, and so, she began to spill the harrowing details. She revealed that Ryan had frantically arrived at her doorstep right at 9 o'clock on the bitter morning of November 22nd, 1987. He was violently trembling and weeping uncontrollably. He had relentlessly hammered his fists against the wood until she finally unlocked the deadbolt. When she anxiously demanded to know what had transpired, he chillingly confessed to just slaughtering Gail and Rick. She begged him in disbelief to repeat those horrific words, and without hesitation, he complied. Ryan detailed how he had driven to the residence late that night under the guise of discussing unresolved family disputes. The disputed camper, the supposed debt Gail owed him, and the toxic resentment that had been festering for months. That fragile dialogue rapidly disintegrated into a vicious altercation. Rick forcefully ordered him off the property, explicitly demanding he never return. Gail had already retreated to the bedroom. Ryan initially departed, only to return 20 minutes later with a deadly motive. He rapped on the door, deceitfully claiming he was experiencing sudden automotive failure. Rick, remarkably still clad in elements of his wedding attire from just 48 hours prior, hastily shoved his work boots over his formal slacks and stepped out into the dark to offer assistance. As Ryan slowly closed the distance to the parked Blazer, Rick helpfully rolled down the driver's side window. 2 deafening gunshots erupted at point-blank range. Rick was effectively executed before he could react. Coldly stepping over the threshold, Ryan navigated the shadowy hallway and slipped into the master bedroom. Gail lay peacefully asleep upon their waterbed, blissfully ignorant of the approaching nightmare. 3 brutal shots shattered the silence. Following the carnage, he calmly exited the premises. Pam remained seated opposite the rapt detectives, her pale hands rigidly intertwined upon the sterile tabletop. Pausing briefly, she then descended into the morbid aftermath. Later that exact same afternoon, Ryan had phoned her, requesting permission to visit. She reluctantly granted him access. Upon his arrival, he completely bypassed her home. Instead, he steered the vehicle directly toward Ransom Street. Parking ominously close to the crime scene, he exited the car and physically dragged her toward Rick's blood-soaked Blazer. She peered into the darkness. Rick's lifeless form had not moved. Seizing her wrist, Ryan dragged her through the corridor and into that dreaded bedroom. Peeling back a crimson-soaked cushion from Gail's lifeless face, he locked a dead-eyed stare on his surviving sibling. A striking sight, isn't it? Pivoting toward Pam, he delivered a chilling ultimatum, one destined to dictate her every waking moment for the ensuing quarter-century. Should you utter a single syllable to the authorities, this exact gruesome fate awaits both you and your little boy. That suffocating memory anchored itself to Pam's soul, starting late 1987. It shadowed her marriage, the birth of 3 infants, and decades of deceiving law enforcement, her relatives, and her own conscience. This dark truth became an unseen phantom, haunting her living spaces and crashing every holiday dinner. It lingered like a specter during the couple's gloomy cemetery interments. Yet, at long last, this psychological torture reached its definitive conclusion. Investigators wasted 0 seconds. The second Pam's confession concluded. Strike teams deployed, placing Ryan Weingarden in handcuffs that very afternoon on January 18, 2013. Authorities approached him head-on, fully briefed on his dark past and terrifying potential for violence. Surprisingly, the suspect offered absolutely 0 physical struggle. However, hearing the grim accusations vocalized turned his features to absolute stone. The suspect immediately began spinning tales, branding Pam a fabricator, accusing investigators of brainwashing her, and painting himself as an innocent scapegoat. A property raid yielded a .22 caliber long gun, yet the fatal hand cannon, the very piece Pam witnessed in his grip following the slaughter, remained completely untraceable. That crucial firearm had been permanently discarded during his 2.5 decades, roaming unchecked. His bloody garments from the massacre vanished similarly. Placed inside his trunk at dawn, those crucial items were subsequently erased from existence without a single trace. Ultimately, missing forensics proved irrelevant. The investigation transcended tangible proof. It became a profound quest for undeniable reality. That long-buried reality had forcibly surfaced. Confined behind bars, the accused drafted 29 desperate dispatches to his sister, alternating between pleading for a retraction and pure rage. Several epistles promised divine retribution for her supposed treason, viciously labeling the traumatized woman a pathetic, spineless fabricator. He relentlessly insisted corrupt investigators had mentally battered her, implanting false memories into her fragile psyche. Promising severe consequences for her actions, his words backfired. Detectives meticulously cataloged each piece of correspondence directly into the growing prosecution dossier. These ominous missives painted a terrifying psychological profile for the upcoming courtroom battle. Proceedings commenced in March 2014 against the 51-year-old defendant. Over 60 individuals provided sworn testimony as state attorneys methodically constructed an inescapable, suffocating trap of evidence. They highlighted a recreational vehicle dispute, brewing monetary stress, paralyzing dread of unmasking, and a toxic envy rotting his core while his sibling achieved an unattainable success. Lifelong companion Jimbo Meacham offered crucial statements alongside Tass, an ex-employer from a local logging outfit. An acquaintance recalled sharing a Dawn Brew post-massacre, listening as the suspect detailed the couple's gruesome demise hours before authorities ever notified surviving relatives about the newly discovered corpses. Meacham vividly recalled that dialogue. He pinpointed highly specific massacre elements the suspect carelessly divulged intimate crime scene facts utterly impossible for an innocent bystander to possess. Medical examiners commanded the courtroom floor, utilizing anatomical skull replicas to trace the precise, devastating trajectories of every fired projectile. The expert then illuminated a subtle, chilling anomaly hiding within the collected forensics. Thick crimson stains painted the driver's wheel of the victim's SUV. While the deceased originally collapsed upon that column, responding units discovered the corpse mysteriously contorted toward the opposite door. The cadaver's final resting orientation starkly contradicted the established splatter patterns. An unknown force had manipulated the scene post-execution. Shortly after, the sister faced the jury box unflinching, resolute, and devoid of tremors. Locking eyes with the panel, she unleashed the buried truth, detailing that dawn her weeping brother arrived on her porch. His dark admission, their grim voyage to Ransom Street, the corpses, the bloodied cushion, and the horrific ultimatum all mirrored her initial wintertime police interrogation flawlessly. Her tone remained chillingly composed throughout. Conversely, the defendant managed a mere 10 minutes of restraint prior to utterly unraveling. Leaping aggressively from his designated seat, he hurled explosive vocal assaults toward the witness stand. Screaming accusations of pure wickedness, he feigned shock at her supposedly fabricated testimony. Armed bailiffs swarmed the volatile scenario instantaneously. The presiding magistrate promptly ejected the violent instigator from proceedings. Taking the oath himself later, the accused minimized his horrific bond with Gail, brushing it off as mere prepubescent experimentation. His narrative fractured, shifting developmental stages 9 and 12, maybe 13 or 14, then 15 and 12, audaciously claiming the taboo dynamic was entirely consensual. Feigning apathy toward potential exposure to his brother-in-law, he denied possessing any murderous intent. State attorneys brutally dismantled this facade. They relentlessly attacked his fractured timeline, weaponizing his ever-changing narratives and exposing the glaring logical craters within his sworn testimony. Sobbing pathetically before the gallery, the cornered killer played the ultimate victim, bewildered that his closest female relatives were engineering his downfall. He audaciously threatened massive civil litigation against local authorities. The panel was entirely unfazed. Following a brief 4-hour discussion on March 28, 2014, the verdict dropped like an anvil. Double homicide, highest degree. The convicted man stared blankly downward during the damning proclamation. Being marched toward incarceration, he muttered a final, hollow denial to empty air. "I am an innocent man." Final judgment commenced on April 21, 2014. The court granted the condemned 60 minutes for parting statements before delivering his ultimate fate. He milked every single second of his allotted time. Spewing vitriol, he painted himself as the ultimate victim of a rigged and unjust machine. Casting his eyes upward, he audaciously interrogated the Almighty about why a righteous soul was suffering. Between these theatrical pleas, he hurled vicious insults at the prosecuting attorneys and lead investigators. After brazenly branding the magistrate a fraud, the court's patience snapped. The official delivered a chilling ultimatum. Utter another syllable, and he would be physically chained and silenced right in his chair. The magistrate then detailed the sheer horror of Ryan's actions. He unequivocally branded the grim event as a savage, unmerciful slaughter. The courtroom echoed with the description of a profoundly manipulative predator, an ice-hearted monster who ruthlessly extinguished 2 futures without a shred of human empathy. The final verdict was absolute. 2 consecutive life terms behind concrete, forever denying him the outside world. Outside those very walls, Rick's sibling, Bud, addressed the lingering press. He expressed a profound sense of relief that the suffocating mystery was finally over. The family possessed not only the grim facts of their demise, but the dark motives behind it. Acknowledging the psychological toll, he commended Pam for finally breaking her silence, expressing deep gratitude for the immense courage required to step out of the shadows. Cheryl offered a far more somber reflection. She softly noted that her beloved sibling had lingered in the dark, awaiting vindication for 27 grueling years. Now, the heavy burden lifted, she could finally visit Gail's resting place to whisper that the nightmare had ended, allowing her to eternally sleep beside Rick. Dorothy Winding, the mother torn between predator and prey, vehemently rejected the court's truth. She took her final breath, fiercely clinging to the delusion of her son's innocence. Her life ended on October 8, 2021, at the age of 90. Wendell had perished 16 years prior, taking the agonizing, unresolved mystery to his own grave. Gail was forever robbed of her voice. Pam severed her matrimonial ties with the monster. 3 desperate attempts at overturning the conviction were filed, and 3 times, the doors remained firmly shut. Today, Ryan Winding rots in a cage. Meanwhile, Gail Wingard had simply yearned for a quiet existence, a sanctuary on 20 acres, a devoted partner, and a perfectly decorated room for a future child. Her journey was brutally cut short at 22 years. In exchange, her killer earned a double eternity surrounded by steel and concrete. Caught in the chasm between those two figures lies the devastating reality of his monstrous choices. Before we conclude this dark chapter, consider 3 unsettling thoughts. Should Pam have been prosecuted for guarding that macabre secret for 25 years? Or does she belong in the tragic category of Ryan's countless casualties? Was she merely a puppet, manipulated so thoroughly that keeping quiet felt like her sole means of survival? Which chilling aspect of this investigation disturbed you the most? Finally, ponder this. During those last 2 weeks, when colleagues observed her sudden withdrawal, did Gail subconsciously realize a predator was circling? Did her intuition scream of impending doom? Was she agonizingly close to asking for help? Share your psychological read on this tragedy. The memories of the fallen endure only when we refuse to let their stories fade into the dark.